It's I think because Christian is not here, I would like to ask you to introduce yourselves first, because I'm not prepared to do it properly myself. Yes, you can go ahead. Yes, please.
So, good morning. So my name is Koen van Balen. I'm the director of the Raymond Lemaire International Centre of Conservation at K.U.Leuven. Also one of the initiators of, is it working?
No. No. Also, unit.
I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm sorry. So my name is Koen van Balen. I'm the director of the Raymond Lemaire Centre for Conservation at K.U.Leuven. Also one of the initiators of Hercule, which is an interdisciplinary institute on cultural heritage, transversal through the whole university. I'm working quite a long time in the field of cultural heritage, member of ICOMOS, also member of the Council of Europa Nostra, and I've been just closing a few weeks ago the Illucidare Horizon 2020 project, which was dealing with cultural heritage, led innovation in culture. So I think that will do.
Ugo, please.
So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I am the lucky, actually, project advisor of this project. It has been a journey, and it's nice to be on a actually quite stable platform and not an online platform for a change after 2.5 years of online meetings. What I want to say is, okay, I work as a project advisor at the European Research Executive Agencies, which is one of the agencies set by the Commission to manage research and innovation projects. And I've been working a lot in the Commission family in the DG Research and Innovation and writing some of the calls that allowed amazing projects like this one to be funded. So I'm quite proud about the work that we've been doing across governance, which is one of the topics of today's discussion. As a background, I'm an economist rooted in institutional analysis, so very happy to be here in this particular policy debate because I think it's hugely relevant for us at the European level as well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ugo. Just one last practical before we before we start the conversation, which we definitely imagine more of as a conversation, as a dialogue or trialogue. Please, we will make it interactive. We definitely open the floor, so take notes, ask questions, and also a shout out to the online participants. Please insert your questions to the chat box, and Olga will be your mouth in this case, and we'll post them. So I think I will start with a very general question, but I'm very curious about your different perspectives, both from university and both from the Commission, how you perceive the main changes in heritage governance for the last decades, and which do you see as a positive outcome, and which is what you might regard as more problematic?
Okay, so I think it's quite an endeavor if you have to give a full answer on that question. But I may be lucky that I've been working quite a long time in the heritage field, so I've seen some changes, and as the Raymond Lemaire Centre was set up by Raymond Lemaire, so some of you may know him, was the drafter of the Venice Charter. I think we can see all of those changes. To draft it in brief, I think we have probably started from experts advocating for the importance of cultural heritage when it was threatened by city development, modernity. I think it's something which is also working in the field of material sciences, things where I'm working in. And you see gradually coming up the fact that, of course, that experts notice that you may be good in preserving the fabric, understand history, but at a certain sense, if that heritage is not carried by society, then you have problems. And I think that's where the big shifts are going, probably to the discussions that we have today about whose heritage are we talking about, who should manage it. And of course, sometimes you see this very let's say, in a very problematic way when you're talking about World Heritage, because then it becomes like the world thinks that it can manage something, which is very often from local population or local communities. And of course, this kind of tensions, of course, helps us to understand this. Another aspect which I see changing, because your project is dealing also with adaptive reuse, is probably also understanding about what use and reuse is. And my stake here, and I think it's quite valid in many cases, is the understanding that everything is temporary use. And of course, if you talk with people in the church, for example, as an organization, they will tell you, but those things have been made for eternity. And so we cannot discuss in terms of temporality. But I think that if you align the concepts of the respect for a place because you know that you use it only for a short time, that respect aligns very much with a lot of principles which we have in the Venice Charter, which says, okay, yeah, you are the temporary custodian, so you take care of it, but you know that you have to give it back in some way or another. And I think that's also the essence of heritage in a certain sense. It's always about transferring. And I think in the field of adaptive reuse, I think it may probably help a lot if you understand that. And of course, that brings us again back to the communities. So just a few highlights. We can discuss about more things later on.
Please, Ugo, react, and then we can continue from here.
Yeah, I think I do share some of the points you mentioned. I think from the European perspective, what I see as a huge step forward is the change in static versus dynamic. So I think at the beginning, if I look when actually we set the first expert group where Christian was one of the members on cultural heritage as an asset for the EU, there was this concept of governance as a very classic layer between the local, the regional, the national, and the EU level, with an ad hoc international cooperation layer. And in this kind of static, while moving quite horizontally, vertically, from the bottom to the top and vice versa, there was this idea that lots of work at the EU level was focused on conservation, so how to protect and conserve the physical asset of the tangible part of the cultural heritage. And then when we were looking at the intangible part, there was a strong focus on authenticity. So what is there, how to preserve also the authentic values. And I think in particular through Horizon 2020, and now I think the new policies that we have, even the new European Bauhaus, we are actually moving towards a much more dynamic governance system where not only we are assuming that this layered top-down versus bottom-up works always in a very fluid way, because there have been brokers of knowledge and cultural heritage, and who owns cultural heritage. So ownership is not actually vertical, it's more horizontal, and I think that's a big step forward. But I think the other big change is also that this distinction between tangible and intangible became also more fluid, and actually intangible part became tangible through adaptive reuse. Because when you reuse a place, there is a lot of reuse in terms of values and social norms attached to that place. You're not just, changing the use, you're also changing the norms that were attached to that. And I think one of the key question key words in your question was about trust. And I think, it's for me pretty amazing to see that we are engaging a debate around power from a very institutionalized EU perspective, because there is a lot of power attached in the intangible heritage, and our calls became, I think, quite dynamic in the way heritage has been framed. Today is a very important day for me. It's the International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia, and heritage is attached to history, and the narrative that we have around gender, sexuality, ethnicity, it's all embedded in these calls on the EU research and innovation. So I think the journey is not maybe perfect yet, but we really went from this rigid narrative on governance to a more fluid, but fluidity is also about intersectionality of values and social norms of the intangible heritage, but also intersectionality of solution that rural area that cities can use, working at the intersection between social, cultural, nature-based and technological innovation?
There are so many things I would love to pick up, but I have difficulty actually taking notes and paying attention to you at the same time. So I like the term temporality, even, you know, for churches, that it's temporarily used, but it has to be given back to the community. And from Ugo's, I love the term dynamic, how dynamic changes. So in this context, how do you see, in this context, you know, framed by, you know, long-term temporary uses, let's say, you know, sometimes 100 years, and also dynamism and community, how do you see the role of small initiatives? What can they do? What should they do, or what they shouldn't do?
Yesterday I was at a presentation of a book by Geert Mak. Some of you may know him, and he's writing about Europe. And he was saying that he writes a lot about Amsterdam. And what he was telling me yesterday is that his belief, and I think it's right, is that the future is created at the local level. And particularly in cities. I think that's also the importance of the role of initiatives like Interreg, if we bring it back to the European level. Why small initiatives are important is also, in a certain sense, or I can translate it in a certain sense, in the way how we start to understand that we cannot model the future, and we cannot model completely what the future is giving us. So it means that by doing small things, we walk step by step, and we can act, and we can monitor, we can measure. And so I think that's in an article which was in the newspaper in Flanders about the debate which is ongoing about the farm in the Abbey of Averbode. There was a very interesting perspective by the journalists to say, okay, are we listening to the engineers, or are we listening to the ecologists? But behind that is a completely different spirit. It's about the spirit of engineers, and I'm an engineer, so I can say it, is in a certain sense too much sometimes believing on models and what is outcome of models, and basically forcing sometimes other people as an expert to follow those models. And I think that the difference with ecologists is basically, yeah, you work with the people or with nature, and you don't know exactly what is the outcome. So you wait for the outcome, and then you work step by step. And it's also very key to our way of approaching preventive conservation in the UNESCO chair that is dealing with that, is about small steps and monitoring. So bringing it a little bit to another for all, my belief is that cultural heritage is a way to create narratives, to work with people, to create narratives, and to be able to imagine the future and negotiate those futures with each other. So that's why I think that's the power of small initiatives for me.
Shall we welcome Christian first?
Yes, I think I was wondering what to do now. So, welcome, Christian. Maybe can you say a few words about yourself and introduce? So we have a very important member of the panel who has just arrived.
Sorry to be late. My name is Christian Ost. I think that we know each other very well. I'm an economist, and we have two PhD in economics in a conservation conference, which is something that you should imagine that it's not easy to deal with. And I, for the time being, president of the Raymond Lemaire International Conservation Centre in K.U.Leuven. I used to be a dean also in a business school in Brussels. This is it.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. I think I pass the word to Ugo then, and then we'll just broaden the discussion.
Yeah, I think coming back to your question, Anna, you mentioned temporality and dynamic, and I think what I see the main challenges for us is the assessment. How do you assess at a policy level social impact? And yet again, I see a bit of change in the narrative because, you know, when I joined the Commission, I can say nearly 10 years ago, there was this obsession about, you know, we have a lighthouse project, look what they've done at the infrastructure level is solid, is concrete, going back to the engineer part, it exists in terms of infrastructure. That doesn't mean that we do not need this kind of big lighthouse projects that invest on ICT, energy efficiencies, or sustainable mobility. I think they're, of course, highly relevant. But when you look at the way then culture heritage was framed in these kind of calls, there was an obsession on, yeah, but how long does, you know, a community need in terms of timing to have some impact? Those are very small initiatives, and they will actually die at some point if a member of the community will move, let's say, from Ghent to Leuven. And I think what we, and it took us a huge amount of time, start realizing is that rather than focusing on the outcome, which is yet important for certain projects, processes are equally important. And this, you know, emphasis on co-creation is not just a buzzword. Sometimes, you know, people, when reading our call or our policy text, they always have this criticism, oh, there was so many buzzwords in the European jargon. It's true. But when you see that a powerful word like co-creation and co-deployment is associated to a huge amount of funding, equally to the funding that is associated to grey infrastructures, it's there that the time has made a huge change. And I think time is also linked to another two words. I mean, I'm an institutional economist, so I cannot not mention her, Ostrom, when she was talking about the prisoner dilemma. You know, the cooperation, sometimes everyone knows it's, you know, effective, but we don't cooperate. And I think it took us time to understand the need to cooperate with the local level without burning the social innovation that was happening at the ground. Social innovation needs experimentation. Creative in the adaptive use of cultural heritage needs time to breathe. The way we assess the social impact there cannot be the same as the way we assess other infrastructure projects. We haven't yet, I think, got, and this is a big step forward that the EU funding, particularly for research innovation, needs to do, a robust system to assess how cooperation and trust are actually realized in projects like this one, but we definitely need to do that. And the way to do that is not just by yet again proposing a fancy cost-benefit analysis. It's really trying to see that there is a value in social capital. That's why within economics, whether you like it or not, culture and social capital are considered a capital. I mean, yeah, we are imperfect, we don't have much any systems, but even there, the social impact, I think, is starting to harvesting the time invest, because it's an investment in time to create trust and cooperation. And this investment in time reflects in the way the different governance layer may or may not interact. And I think that is quite crucial.
I think it's very comforting to be among economists, because I really can talk about, or engineers, capital, because time, I think to have time and to have network and to have knowledge, that's the, you know, the classic sociology from Bourdieu, that's the capital you have. And now, playing the devil's advocate, let me ask, and this is something, you know, that I've struggled with personally working on OpenHeritage. We often portray, and I actually strongly believe in the role of the very important role of small civic initiatives representing local communities. Now comes the question whether, I mean, we do have a system in place for formal democracy. Everyone, it's, you know, you can vote every 4 years or every 5, depending on your country, but you can vote, you know, and it's not much time. But working in civic initiatives takes you time, you need networks and knowledge, And so this is sort of a typical shortcoming, I think, often in these projects, whether local initiatives, when they want to redefine together what heritage is, manage to actually reach out to their local communities. So that's basically an open question to comment to all of you and react to each other.
I may try to answer to your question by rebounding also on what Ugo just said about time, because in the challenge about getting what you just mentioned is a question of coordination about different discipline, different field, but also different moment in time. So when I come back on this notion of time is the fact that we usually in conservation, not maybe here about specialists, but we see time as a timeline. So that means that you get the past, where the building, the monument was done, you get the present, where the conservation and protection is at stake, and then you get the future about the further generations. We see that as a timeline. And we have the same, it's not a timeline, it's basically different cycles going on. And you get cycle of maintenance, cycle of preservation, but you get also cycle of adaptive reuse of building. You know, because this is where changes mean something. And you realize that to make some sound governance there or sound management of this conservation process, you need also to take a perspective of cycle in economic terms or in other dimensions. That means that there is no starting point and then an end to that. And I like to come back always on this perspective, because one of my references is Joseph Schumpeter. You may have heard about Joseph Schumpeter, who looked at innovations and had the development basically in terms of cycle. So you get some innovations which create a new cycle, which creates something that can go along a trend, but basically you need always and all the time to reinvent and to recreate some other things. And this is where these different cycles should be coordinated, which is not easy. Because when we speak about governance, you may say that there is a time or there is a moment for conservation, for the monument, where you need some public intervention, some, I would say, public governance, basically, in terms of protection, in terms of regulation, in terms of intervention on the market, in terms of decision, that kind of governance. And there is other times when the governance should or could be led to the local community in order to take charge of something that does exist and to provide, some new ideas, some new adaptive reuse, some new innovations. And I think that what is really challenging is that this balance between some public intervention or some public governance and some more local governance, some more bottom-up approach is something that it's not a given. It's not a given. It's something that should evolve over time. When you realize these days about some companies, some startups or some innovation, you see that they're not just innovate in terms of technologies, in terms of the products, but also on the process of taking a decision, the process of making a participation about the different stakeholders. And you see that this kind of innovations actually is really what drives the success of these innovations. And this is something that I think we should keep in mind, that remain open to some local initiatives when it's we realize that it's more effective to do so, and then to shift maybe between different ways of governing and about of decision making. So, well, this is a bit this adequation, I would say, about some consideration that can appear as conflicting, but that at the end can, of course, go together hand in hand.
Okay, so maybe at this point I could share an experience that we have had in Ecuador. So it's a project with the University of Cuenca in the framework of our UNESCO chair on preventive conservation and in the framework of collaboration between Flemish Flanders universities and universities in the south. We have been experimenting with them, and I think in a certain sense it also shows that certain types of labs or living labs or whatever you can call them are sometimes more easy to create in certain contexts than others. And we experimented initially with a campaign of maintenance of 40-50 houses in a rural village with the local people. And there you see, of course, a little bit what Christian is saying, is that you have to understand which are the different stakeholders and how different stakeholders can collaborate. So the local rural area is interesting because still in Ecuador you have a very strong organization of the church. So they were able to work or let's say, make this local people work together. But at the end of the line, we work together with them, with the students of the university, with the professor of the universities, with the local administration, and also with the army. It was quite interesting at that moment. So you bring a lot of different types of knowledges and capacities together and resources. And for a very, very small budget, we were able to do that maintenance with those people, each at their own role. So what does it mean? Is that, of course, you have different stakeholders, they have all these different capacities, and you have to coordinate it or bring them, align them. And what is the role here? And I've seen it also, I think even last week when we were discussing it in Brussels. I think it's also understanding what is the role of academia, what is the role of the university there. And I think the university in that sense is a kind of a trigger, can trigger a number of things, but of course it requires the university, and that is particularly the case with the people who work there, to have all of those kind of connections. But also to realize, for example, that there is a very big difference between rural and cities. So later on we did a similar experiment, but then in the city of Cuenca, and understanding that there the role of the church is less. So you have to find other ways of coordinating those activities. So understanding this multiple stakeholder, and also the fact that it is context-based, so it's very, very specific. But of course, understanding the sensibility, having the sensibility and understanding what those roles can be, I think is crucial, whether it is public local authority or whether it is local communities. And I think that's where, again, commons, I guess, could be an interesting way to reflect on. And my take, in a certain sense, that's also one of the reasons why we developed Hercule, for example, according to the governance of the commons and the peer-to-peer within our own university, is in a certain sense the understanding that what Eleanor also was saying, commons is based on shared values and shared resources. I think that is the essence of cultural heritage as well. So maybe we just have to figure out how to align that governance, some of those fundamental governance principles with what is the fundamental of cultural heritage. And having multiple stakeholders' perspective, I think, is very, very important.
Well, I think, your question on communities and the importance of the local level is kind of an epistemologic journey for the European Union that was built as a community as such, right? And I think, we tend to, stating that the local level is hugely important for our policies is obvious, because people tend to forget that we have one key principle, the subsidiarity principle, which actually is spelling out that we should actually have our action closest to citizens to realize the highest impact. But I want also to be a bit, let's say, provocative within the provocation of your questions, because at the EU level, the journey and the time that we mentioned before are also quite important to realize that, and is linked to the assessment part I was mentioning before, the community is not just a beautiful, rosy, monolithic entity. Within heritage, there is contested heritage. When you work with communities, and here I want to be really provocative, how many projects have been managing that they were doing a stakeholder mapping, or you name it, okay? Well, you do a stakeholder mapping, of course, you try to understand who are your key stakeholders, but your key stakeholder could be all white men and Catholic, let's just, say that. And it's good that actually you joined the panel, because otherwise we would be kind of in a lack of diversity. But I think, when you look at our motto, United in Diversity, I think what is super crucial for us is the diversity of localities where you do have conflicts. I remember when managing one project in the FP7 where we have this instrument for the benefit of civil society organization. There was this kind of instrument in the FP7 program just looking at community-based projects. And I had a coordinator coming back for the final review telling me it's a disaster. I don't know how to report on what happened in Rotterdam, because we found a great example of social innovation, a guy planting mushroom from coffee beans in an abandoned swimming pool, but I don't know how to report that. I mean, how do I report that on a deliverable? I'm like, this is actually great, because what is interesting is not the outcome yet again, is how this guy actually developed a different business model that then we put him on a spotlight. It was in all the newspaper, in all the EU publications. But yet again, of course, what we do, we have lights, right? Sometimes we highlight Matera as a capital of culture. No one, even in Italy, I'm exaggerating, of course, but what I'm saying, Matera became a highlight for some years thanks to this. And then we have now, through the New European Bauhaus Prize, we have a spot on Fabbrica di tutta la Vida. Guess what it's doing? Time banking, how to reward people that actually devote time to a community-based adaptive reuse project. But Fabbrica di tutta la Vita started also as a very contested, how to go against a very industrial project of the past and how to revitalize that by starting in devoting time from different members of the community. And this diversity that is now finally we have mainstreamed really starting from gender is not a given. Gender before was treated as gender mainstreaming and gender flagged call within our action. Gender was an amazing start way of saying community are diverse. And when you put together in the same room people that are disabled, LGBTI-oriented, they are black, or they have an intersectionality of those identities, they will start fighting, and we need to find a way to synthesize this discussion without losing the richness of it. And doing that on a deliverable is not definitely ideal. So I do take that as a self-criticism, but I don't think, and this is an exciting journey, we are not there yet. And we are not there yet, even when we describe co-creation activity. This is really an invitation. I want to also, challenge a bit you guys, because you are a key component of the way we build this narrative. I often read in proposal, we will engage migrant through a work cafe. And I'm like, yeah, sure, welcome, and now let's go together to, I think we really need also to be a bit more critical in the way, because we all know that certain means that we have, even methodologically, will not work. So, and I know that sometimes we often frame calls in a way to put you guys in the shoes to repeat what you repeat. So I think it's a kind of vicious cycle, but this kind of project and this kind of conferences, starting from the bottom up, I think obliges us all to a self-criticism analysis. And let me conclude that time, power, and conflict are often associated with frustration. I do feel frustrated sometimes when I see the development of certain policies, because history is also very cyclical, and sometimes even in very institutionalized organizations, like the one I work in, you do have revival, and sometimes the revival is not always what you would expect, but that happens also in university and big companies. It's not just the public administration, so no one is exempt about that. So I think we also need to accept that sometimes we do accelerate, sometimes we stop and we go backward, but hey, we might have an amazing jump, and that's the beauty of co-creation.
Ugo, you said, I think, the best closing speech ever. Thank you, and I think this was my cue to really open up the floor. I think Fabbrica da Toda la Vita was one of the observatory cases of OpenHeritage, so thank you for mentioning it. And I think what was also mentioned by Koen and Christian, how things are contextual and how they change and how complicated they are. I think these are the things we have been struggling with. So please, dear audience, both online and offline, either raise your hands or post a chat to Olga, and we would be very, very happy to welcome questions or comments from you. And I'm looking for someone, a pioneer. Thank you. Go ahead, Leuven. Sorry, we need a mic.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much for this elaborated notions, and also being very optimistic about where policies go. And I would like to ask one very simple question about, Ugo mentioned about fluid governance, experimentation, collaboration. These are all very key at this level of decision-making and policy-making, right? So we have a level of the EU policies that are all supporting very horizontal governance, collaboration, fluid governance of heritage. And then we see another level of the EU policies, which is the big money, where we don't see any trace of this, which is the structural funds and all other kinds of monies. What should we do to link better these two worlds? And hopefully not from the top to the bottom, but how can we extend all the innovation that you talk about and all the recognition of this innovation that you talk about, all three of you, all four of you, in order to influence the way big decisions are made and big money is distributed?
Yeah, I think I'll first go because it was kind of obvious the relation to. So I start by saying that what you highlighted is true. Definitely we have been, since I joined, and I think but even before, talking about synergies between EU-funded programs. Synergies also implies that when you link things, you link competences, and not all the programs are managed equally between the EU and member states, because there are area of competences and area of responsibilities. Sometimes it's shared, sometimes it's definitely not shared. This is not about blaming the layers of governance. That would be simplistic and not useful at all. I think what I will retain from your question, and I think if you look at the way Horizon Europe is structured with the mission approach, is really a level of building new synergies. Missions, EU missions across the different 5 areas that we highlighted are a way of cutting across several EU-funded programs. Whether or not this will become easy with the structural fund, I don't know, but it's definitely a very good attempt. And to be fair, all our sustainable cities call, where we were kind of a substantial big money, and the one on adaptive use, they all made reference at that time on the leverage of investment, which was indeed a way of saying, look, it's not just about, conserving the cultural asset, which is still important. It's also about the usage, and it's also about looking co-creation. So I don't think, to give a short answer, that tomorrow synergy will be brilliant, but I do believe, and this is not me saying, if you look at the assessment of the different programs, that synergies have been increasing tremendously over the last at least 10 years. Look at what's happening around the linkages between URBAC, the urban innovation actions, what is happening between them, their community and our community in EU R&I projects. Those synergies did not exist before. And it's about also exchanging expertise, it's about knowledge. So yet again, I don't think it will happen from one day to another, because there are governance, yet again, has conflict, and conflict, I don't mean just fighting, it's just like friction between areas of responsibility. So those responsibilities will remain, but I think let's say the pathways towards synergies has been quite accelerating over the last at least 10 years.
Okay, let me take it from another angle, and from the perspective of cultural heritage. If you look to the essence of what maybe the innovation of the Cultural Heritage Counts for Europe report is, while originally the call and Europa Nostra was asked to, let's say, to develop a method to measure the impact of cultural heritage, I think the outcome of it is completely different, because what came out of it is the demonstration how aligning resource streams with cultural heritage makes those resource streams more sustainable. In a certain sense, it's a kind of a mainstreaming of cultural heritage. And I think it had a big impact, this perspective. And so we see it coming up in many more projects, and where maybe cultural heritage, I would not say before that, was seen as something elitarian and marginal, now shows how fundamental it is to understand our identities and contribute to our identities and build on those local places. Now, part of the analysis which brought us to that idea, because it's something that comes from us, is the analysis, for example, of Interreg projects. If you look at Interreg projects, the idea behind Interreg is not about cultural heritage. But we have seen many examples of Interreg projects where people have been, or groups of people, or institutions, communities, have been working together on cultural heritage, and they were much more sustainable, they were much more lasting, and much more sustainable in terms of using the Sustainable Development Goals, although it has deficiencies in there. The other aspect, and I think that's also important to understand, where the money goes in Europe overall, the lobby is a very important aspect. And I think that's again where Europa Nostra, I think, has been contributing a lot to put that very high on the agenda, to be much more obvious a player in advocating for giving resources. And at the same time, and I think that's also important, a little bit I think what also was referring to that project, is to understand that the resources we are talking about, very often we see them in euros, but there is much more. There is time, there is this kind of buildings, there is so much capital, and there is so much resources available, and we tend always to, and that's the dangerous in the cultural heritage field, to try to narrow our discussion and our lobby on those aspects. And I think we have to broaden it up, and I think it's a little bit this holistic perspective that you are referring to, call it transversal or things like that, but so.
Yeah, I may, in the line of what has been said, I may share an experience with you about in terms of training and education, because I used to teach either to architects as an economist, and they don't know a word about, what about resources or cultural capital, and I teach also in business school about cultural economics, and bringing then some question about cultural values, conservation, and that's it. And this is amazing, because when I speak to architects, they see economics as a constraint. And they analyze the cultural values, they see everything about that, but then they're stuck about, you know, how can I finance the project? When you go to the business school with a project about conservation, they see that as an opportunity, not a constraint. It's exactly you see another perspective. Why? Because they get in mind the fact that these cultural values can be, you see, also creating impact for our funds, and they know that there is a lot of money somewhere, and okay, because this is just two different ways to see exactly the same topic, the same issues, and this is why I'm convinced that, of course, these two categories should work together, because they are really complement to each other, but also that as far as conservation is concerned, and the training program that we do at the K.U.Leuven, that conservation specialists should be also mediator. That means that they're not just being specialists in what they do, to know technically speaking about how to do, what to do with the all their skills and all their knowledge about conservation, but that they realize that you get different stakes there that maybe sometimes are conflicting, sometimes not. And this is where the local community usually give you kind of background, where this communication, you know, this information goes through. But they must be aware about that there is different lie, and there is sometimes a sort of trade-off to do, because we live in a democracy, and that all the cultural values can maybe not, I know that this is provocative, but be protected 100%, but where do you put, you see, the line? And this is a question of pluridisciplinarity, I would say, or multidisciplinarity, but this is also the way to find solutions, because you can bring there some solutions that you just, that sometimes you just don't think about that. This is innovation also, or creativity in this sense.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Really, it was magnificently interesting for me. I have loads of questions in my head, but I think it's time for us to leave the platform and let the other group talk about other very interesting things. So, but you can continue the conversation in the